Welcome to the second video in the very basics of U.S. politics and institutions. We ended with the question, first we recognize this is a kind of a crazy, messy system, the so-called balance of powers that really is a constant struggle over power. But we need to spend time going back through the history of governments and talk about the idea of a just state. And if the goal is to create in this continent a just state, where does that idea even come from? It has to be put in a historical context. The European governments had no idea that this entire hemisphere existed. This is a map from 1480 that shows the known world. Of course, the entire Western Hemisphere is not yet here. That doesn't happen until 1492. And yes, there have been some quick visits earlier on, certainly with the Vikings, but nothing that really stuck until this massive sea change in this hemisphere. And what were they trying to do, and what was their idea of government? What was the role of government at the time? It's important for us to recognize, very important, from the very beginning, that this was not an empty continent. Now, when I was in school years ago, we were told, well, maybe there were 25 million natives here at some point, the high population, but it's probably closer to maybe 14 or 15 million. That's nonsense. Before the point of European contact, there were thriving tribal nations. I encourage you to take a look at this site from tribal maps. Or if we imagine even closer in on our circle here, close to home, there were vibrant native populations. Now, before the Europeans, largely the British and French, came to the shores of New England in the early 1600s, even before that, disease had begun to spread through these populations by previous temporary exposures to European diseases. There's this crazy idea that the natives sold Manhattan for just a few dollars. Of course, that's nonsense. This idea that we like to carry around, that we were the civilizing force coming into a largely empty hemisphere, is simply wrong. I encourage you to take a look at this wonderful book by Charles Mann, the second edition. It's called 1491. It'll give us a glimpse of what was happening in the Western Hemisphere before the point of European contact. Of course, there were thriving tribal nations, but how large? If we imagine the Western Hemisphere's population among natives, about 10 million top to bottom in 1700. At 1625, maybe 25 million. But what about at the point of European contact? Well, there's debate over this, and the estimates vary, some well over 100 million. The best current estimate is from an article in 2019 that ranges up to about 78 million. That's a huge population. If we look at the population collapse just in the central area of Mexico, at the point of European contact, best estimate is there were 27 million natives, and it plummeted. Within 100 years, 9 out of 10 were dead. And that's a population that wouldn't be reached again in that region of Mexico until the 1960s, in my lifetime. So let's not continue to walk around with this idea that this was an empty continent. In fact, we can learn a lot by looking at how previous governments were actually structured. How did communities organize themselves? Wonderful work now being done in anthropology and archaeology. I strongly encourage you to take a look at the remarkable diversity of culture and organizational forms within the Americas before European contact. Well, once the European contact takes root, it took a while before my area here in Massachusetts is regularly visited. But by 1639, this is a map from 1639, you'll notice that there were very different versions and regions claiming stakes onto what is now New England. The Virginia territory, of course, was populated by people from the western half of the British island. New Netherland controlled much of the center of the Atlantic region. New England, beginning with the Pilgrims and the Mayflower. And then New France. So it's largely unsettled. And this kind of cultural diversity we need to get our hands on, and we'll spend time with it. So this is the distribution of population within the British colonies in 1775. At that time, of course, Florida is a Spanish property, and the province of Quebec is being battled over between the French and the British. But the population density is very, very low. How were the various governments trying to actually have much authority and control over such a spread out area? The population across the eastern seaboard is about 2.5 million non-natives within the English colonies, just on the eve of our Revolutionary War. There was, though, tremendous variability on who was actually there. This is a brilliant map. You can find it all over the internet. It's worth spending some time with. This shows us the modal populations across the British colonies in 1755. And so, for example, you'll notice an African population, which was the modal, meaning the most common, the most populous population within Charlestown, South Carolina. And up in New England, there are the English and the Welsh. The Germans are throughout Pennsylvania. This map is going to be important to us for us to think through how you take these diverse cultural traditions and somehow create a new form of government. What is it that's going to hold them together? Well, let's take a look at a few of these, beginning with the African American population, the slave population, first going to the Caribbean islands from French trade and British trade and Spanish trade, but then moving into the colonies, beginning in about 1619 and including all of the colonies. For example, in Rhode Island, they didn't get rid of slavery until their Constitution of 1842. This group of African slaves built much of the infrastructure of the country. And they obviously didn't come here voluntarily, yet without their sacrifice, we wouldn't have survived. You know, there's this idea about critical race theory. I don't want to spend any time on the political debates there. I do encourage you to go take a look for yourself. There's a wonderful new book that came out from Ibram Kendi, 400 Souls, with a story about each of the last 400 years. It's absolutely worth reading. Spend some time and give some thanks. You recall from that map I showed earlier from 1639 that there's the sort of New Netherlands. What in the world is that all about? Well, in the 1500s and 1600s, the Netherlands, which also the Dutch, Holland, the lower colonies, the lower regions, these the Dutch were the large economic trading power. They were very interested in truly global trade. They had a remarkable fleet. If you are watching from Australia, you know you used to be in New Holland. If you're watching from New Zealand, you know that Zealand is actually a region in the Netherlands. And New York used to be called New Amsterdam. Now, what was so interesting about the Dutch is that they were very open to different religions and races as long as you could be in the business of making a buck. It's very transactional. They focused on trade, and they built forts and trading areas up through the Hudson. They tended to work relatively well with the native populations. But it was seen as very extractive. They weren't going to stay and create an entirely new branch of the Netherlands. This was a business proposition. Interesting book I'd recommend to you is Holland on the Hudson. Now, the next great groups, these 4 groups, are summarized in Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher. The squiggly line that you see on the map in England is actually the line that roughly demarks the area that was with the British Crown on the western side and against the British Crown in their civil wars of the 1600s. So there were, the king lost his head. So there were civil wars and parts of England that had supported the monarchy, and largely the East Anglia and eastern regions of England that did not support the monarchy, that were supportive of Oliver Cromwell. That'll be important because of who ends up on which sides of the pro-Church of England debate within American history. So if we look at these groups, the first one that, of course, we'll think of in Cambridge is the Puritans. The Puritans didn't call themselves Puritans. They wouldn't have embraced that idea at all. They were Congregationalists, meaning they were governed within their own congregation. There wasn't a huge hierarchy of bishops and a pope. In the Puritan Congregational Church, anybody who wanted to be a minister could be if they had enough followers, and you could get rid of a minister by a simple vote. There was a kind of dynamic competitiveness for souls. Importantly, they were Protestants that were seen as being in opposition to the Church of England. The Church of England, after the Reformation, breaks off from the Roman Catholic Church, and the King of England, in that case Henry VIII, was made the head of the Church of England. Well, the Congregationalists rejected that structure, and in reading the Word of God, believed that they had direct access to the truths and didn't have to be mediated through a hierarchy. Before they came to what's now Massachusetts, the Congregationalists/Puritans went to the Netherlands. Why? Well, because the Netherlands will take people who are, religious outcasts or think a little differently. Within a generation, less than a generation, the Puritan fathers and mothers said, you know what, our children are starting to care a little bit too much for money and fancy dress. And they ended up coming to what's now Massachusetts. They didn't aim for it, but they ended up here, blown off course. And you get the Puritans with the funny hats and the buckle shoes and the strange bell guns. That's the myth, at least. They were seeking to have religious freedom of their own, but that didn't mean that they were going to be accepting of all other religions. Absolutely not. If you were going to be accepted into a community in New England that was dominated by Puritans, you needed to be a member of that church community. Quakers, for example, Quakers were persecuted, in some cases jailed, and in a few cases killed in Boston. So they believed in religious freedom to be Puritans, but not to embrace all other religious traditions. The next group is the opposite of the Puritans, and these are the Church of England types. They come from the region of England that had been supportive of the monarch, and then in the restoration of the crown had clearly been very active. Old England was dominated, of course, by aristocratic families, and money and land was passed on to the oldest born male. It's called primogeniture. Well, the later born sons of the English aristocracy got large land grants in the Virginias, and they sought to create in the Virginias a better version of England itself. So even today, if you go through the countryside in Virginia, you'll think, wow, this kind of looks like English country homes. And that's because it was designed to look like English country homes. The Church of England set down roots. They were slow to embrace education at the household level in the ways that the Puritans had. They tended to worship through the Church of England. And while it was dominated by a few elite families in the Virginias, they were dependent economically on indentured servants from England, and then increasingly on slaves. So you can imagine the tensions that exist between the Puritans and the Church of England. That map I showed earlier of 1639, we have this nice region in the middle called the New Netherlands. Well, you got to do something about that, don't you? You have to do something about that if you're the King of England. He needed something to try and stake a claim to this region. And that's how the Quakers make it into Philadelphia. So the Quakers, because William Penn's family was owed money by the British Crown, the Quakers were extremely clever and fortunate to get large land grants from the King of England. But the Quakers were a new religion at the time. And if you know anything about Quakers, you understand that they are not really big bureaucracy folks, right? Not a lot of structure, not a lot of order, just some peace and let people be. They're open to other religions, and they were a very important stake in the ground for the King of England against the encroaching French and the reminiscent settlers from Holland. Okay, so the Quakers set up shop in Philadelphia, and they opened the doors and began advertising. They began advertising for settlers to come and buy some of the land in terms of the land grants that were given. And much of that advertising went to German populations. We'll talk about the Germans in a moment. But the fourth folkway from Albion Seed is a group that is too often overlooked in American history, incredibly important, and that's the Scots and the Irish. The Scots and the Irish. There are some cartoons that I have that show how the British monarchy thought of the Scots and the Irish as opposed to the Native Americans. The Scots and the Irish were seen as even lower forms of human beings than these noble natives in America. Of course, by the time you get to the 1700s, the Scots and the Irish have been incredibly, horrifically persecuted by the British monarchy. Their lands have been taken away. In many areas, their ability to follow their religious traditions are taken away. And they were cast aside. They wanted nothing to do, of course. If they were going to leave, they wanted nothing to do with England. Where are they going to go? They could go into New England through Boston's open port. Oh, yeah, but they're not all that welcoming of people, are they? Especially people who might be Catholics. Oh, then could they go through the Virginias? Why? And see the younger children of the landed aristocracy who they're trying to flee? No. The Scots and the Irish, some went directly into what is now Canada. A few actually went to South America, but overwhelmingly, the Scots and the Irish go through the open port in Philadelphia. The Quakers are selling land. The Quakers are saying, come on in. And the Scots and the Irish just wanted to be left alone with their families. They wanted to survive. They didn't trust government, certainly not the British government. And so within just 2 generations, you get a remarkable migration of Scots and Irish. First through Philadelphia, then out to the western parts of Philadelphia. It was then called the Allegheny Mountains. And then down into the Appalachian Mountains. Some of the Scots and the Irish go up into New York. Many remain, of course, in western Pennsylvania. But they're largely cut off from any of the trade and activity that's along the eastern shore. The Scotch and the Irish are gone. They want to be left alone. They want to be able to honor their family and their religious traditions without the British involvement. Okay, the last group we're going to talk about for now, these are my people, because my name King actually comes from König, the Germans who came into America. And the German influence in Pennsylvania really shouldn't be overlooked. It's really massive. Now, you may have heard of the Pennsylvania Dutch. What you might not know is that the Pennsylvania Dutch are actually Pennsylvania Deutsch. It was a word for German, Pennsylvania German, Pennsylvania Deutsch, and massive, massive migrations. When we look at the first formal census that happens in 1790, you're looking at a population in Pennsylvania that's probably on the order of 60% German. It's really quite remarkable. Benjamin Franklin, who grew up in Massachusetts and then hightails it for Philadelphia, owned a German-speaking newspaper. Now, he was also worried about the fact that they weren't speaking English, and how could you govern this kind of community? But the Germans are incredibly important. See, the Germans were fleeing religious persecution as well, but also chaos. They brought entire families here. Unlike the Scots and the Irish, when they came through Pennsylvania or through Philadelphia, the Germans would sort of hop on a barge and go down the Schuylkill River and build a stone house, and later build a stone barn. They're not going anywhere. So the population is really quite impressive. The area around Pennsylvania or around Philadelphia, or if you look in Berks County, about 85% of the population there in 1790 was German. So this is one awfully crazy quilt of a country. I encourage you to take a look at Colin Woodard's remarkably entertaining and just fabulous book, The 11 Nations of North America, because it'll give you a feeling for how the cultural traditions that took root back before we were founded as an independent nation, how those continue through today. This is also a clip that comes out of Colin Woodard's book. And if this map looks a little bit familiar, pay attention to things like, I don't know, where are the religious traditions in the United States now? These are participating religious groups by the largest or the modal participating group in 2010. You can see some of the same sorts of regions that are highlighted based on the cultural foundations of each area. How does that happen? How does a country hold on to something like a creation myth while having such tremendously diverse backgrounds? Well, that's another book by Colin Woodard I'd encourage you to take a look at. We are a nation of immigrants. You may have certain kinds of views on immigration. I don't care what they are. The reality is that we are a nation largely of immigrants. And immigrants into the United States are different from the folks who stayed back home. They're more risk accepting. They're much more likely to be later born children, less likely to be respectful of hierarchies. Even today, somebody who manages to get into this country through the whole visa process and gets a green card and applies for and maintains themselves here and gets citizenship, it's an incredibly difficult proposition. So our immigration system is the engine that drives so much of the American myth, in a way, that continues the philosophies from the original sets of immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. All right, we've done a little bit on the Western Hemisphere, but I want to take us even further back. Remember that we're supposed to be thinking about the form of a perfect state, or what is a just state. Well, that's going to take us into a deeper part of world history. I mentioned that there were probably somewhere around close to 100 million natives in the Western Hemisphere at the point of European contact. There are also in world history areas that they're considered right now 6. There might end up being 7, but there are 6 cradles of civilization. A cradle of civilization is an area independent of each other that turned towards agriculture and a centralized city-state. No more hunter-gatherer trading bands. This is the emergence of a centralized state with often, of course, ways to record what people were buying and selling, and a hierarchy of classes and abilities that came with it. Now, although these are 6 separated cradles of civilization, their ways of governing actually develop in highly similar ways. Let's just take a fairly cartoonish view of the structure of the state and the relationship between the individual and the state in ancient Egypt, for example. The pharaoh sits at the top of that pyramid, and the pharaoh has direct access to the gods, to the wisdom of the gods, is surrounded by a priestly class and nobles. And most of us, right, what would we be? We'd be servants and slaves or farmers or maybe a craftsman of some sort or another. This is the typical approach, this hierarchical system where somebody or some family at the top represents the will of the divine. It's across all 6 of the cradles of civilization. A priestly class emerges, claims divine authority, and then there's a strict hierarchical system underneath it. Well, this is also a system that's reflected in and justified in one of the most remarkable books you're ever going to see, and that's Plato's Republic. What Plato is looking for in the Republic is, well, he's trying to describe how you would create a government on earth that reflects the justice in heaven, or the equivalent of heaven. He calls it a form. What's the form of a just state? The question that motivates this particular lecture. To get there, let's first do a quick pass through what we mean by Platonic forms. You and I recognize this as a chair, right? I call it a chair, you call it a chair. We all know that's a chair. How do we know it's a chair? Well, it just is, right? And then Plato says, hold on a moment. How do you know that thing's a chair? Couldn't it be something else? Well, look around, you can see other things that look like chairs. You classify them as chairs. All of these things look like chairs. Plato says, what do they have in common? What they have in common is their essential chairishness. What they have in common is that they are all, and this is the key phrase, temporal, physical manifestations of the form of the chair. Now, this is an important concept. The idea is that on earth, what we experience is a reflection of the ideal, of the form, the Platonic form of a chair. You and I are interacting with these things, right? But there's only one chair, and everything that you and I look at is a temporal, physical manifestation of a chair. It just so happens that you and I are smart enough to be able to say, well, that's a chair. We can kind of come to an agreement on it. There are other things that we might come to agreement on, right? There's the ideal form of anything on earth. So everything that exists on earth is a temporal, physical manifestation of the ideal in this realm of the forms. Think of it maybe as kind of like heaven. But then Plato asks us to imagine something more difficult. You and I can look around and say, oh, that's a chair, and that looks like a pretty good chair. But who can tell us what a just state looks like? If the idea of a just state exists in the realm of the forms, how do we recognize it when we're right here on earth? And so Plato's Republic is a wonderful dialogue in which he's trying to bring people along through a conversation to understanding how one would identify and then build a just state here on this temporal earth, when maybe not everybody can be smart enough to figure out how the state ought to operate. No surprise, spoiler alert, Plato, who's a philosopher, says what you really need is a philosopher to be in charge. You need a philosopher because only a philosopher can really see into the complex world up there and help us define a just state on earth. Now you need to surround that philosopher with the structure of government. You need an aristocracy within that government that will be the group of people who make and maintain rules and governmental structures that prop us up. And out of this aristocracy, you'll have the priestly class. Plato tells us, by the way, it's a really good idea to include in all of this religious institutions so that the philosopher king is actually religiously endowed with divine rights. Now, Plato recognizes, of course, that people, normal everyday people, if you try and create this system, they're not going to go along with it, right? Who's going to sign up and say, yeah, I'll be the slave, I'll be the servant, I'll be the craftsman? Now, everyone's going to want to be in the priestly class or maybe even be the philosopher king. So what do you need? Plato says every civilization needs a foundation myth. A foundation myth, something not true, but a foundation myth that we can believe in that helps to order our place in society, usually embedded within religious institutions. And in Plato's Republic, he describes the myth of What's so important is to remember that you can't have the foundation of a new state without a foundation myth that justifies this hierarchical system. So this is the structure of government described in Plato's Republic. It also turns out to be the structure of government that was present in all 6 of the cradle civilizations. So all of these civilizations create the same, more or less, form of hierarchical, centralized government with divine right monarchs and priestly class. And the people, you and me, we are not citizens, we're subjects. Right? Largely, we're subjects. There are a few times in human history where that wasn't the case, but for the most part, this is the tradition that's passed along. St. Augustine, the great early saint in the Christian tradition, was a huge fan of Plato. And his description of heaven and earth very self-consciously mirrors that of Plato's philosophy. And within the Roman Catholic Church, before the Protestant Reformation, remember that the Pope was God's representative on earth, surrounded by a priestly class. Importantly, the texts of the Bible, the Holy Scriptures, are read only by those within the priestly class, often in Latin that's not used outside of the church, in some cases in Greek or Aramaic, depending on the tradition. But the normal parishioners, you and I, and we don't have access to the Word of God. The Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, Martin Luther thought he was a good Catholic until his death. He didn't want to abolish the Catholic Church. He wanted to improve the Catholic Church by making the vernacular, the Word of God, open. The vernacular is an everyday language that people talk. Publish the Bible with this new printing press. Let's publish the Bible in German, in every language, so people can read the Word of God directly. Protestant Reformation was not built on the word protest, but protext. Protestant means they're in favor of having access directly to the Word of God. Okay, so this country is founded overwhelmingly as a Protestant country and as a rejection of some of this kind of structure of the hierarchical system, the ancient regime. Wow, okay. If this is what the world looked like in the 16 and 1700s, and now you have these various populations, 2.5 million non-natives living in the British colonies, really cut off from England, having just, survived a war that ends with the French and Indian War, and the taxes then become increased on the population. They wanted to have more direct access to government and to what they thought were their own rights. Because instead of a divine right monarch out of Plato, what you had was a divine right monarch called King George III. And this is the man against whom the revolution is launched. Pay attention to how these words work. What you see here is an early version, early draft of the Declaration of Independence, written primarily, of course, by Thomas Jefferson, but also a committee weighs in. And then pay attention to the key phrases. It's all coming together now. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's a powerful comment. Because in that early part of that sentence, you're doing a run around the traditional structure of government. What Tocqueville would later talk about as the ancient regime, this idea that people have natural rights. The ancient regime was the old hierarchical system. The Enlightenment approach is that we have access directly to the Word of God and to our natural rights, and that our rights exist outside of the structure of the state. See, in the ancient regime, what was your right? Your rights came from the government. They were defined through and by the government. But your rights in this new state, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Notice how aspirational some of this is. Did the people on the committee writing the Declaration of Independence actually believe that all men were created equal? Certainly not. Jefferson owned slaves, Washington owned slaves. These were people who were imagining that the aristocrats in England know better than they are. That's the kind of equality they were after. We're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Originally drafted as the pursuit of property, that's a little too radical. But pay attention to the deep meaning here of what does life mean, and what does liberty mean, and what does happiness actually mean. Life, liberty, and happiness, who can be against those things? Well, you know what? The founders believed that it was the government that gets too large, that gets in the way of the access to those inalienable rights. This is the most amazing part of our founding. We're founded as a new form of government by rejecting the old form of government and not quite figuring out what was going to come next. What they knew was that government was too big, it was too strong, and you can't trust the government. Because if you do trust the government, they're going to take away your property, they're going to quarter soldiers, they're going to raise your taxes without representing you. This is a heck of a revolutionary comment. But it also leaves us in a very difficult position because our founding institutions were created with the idea that you can't trust government. And if you should fear something, you should fear an efficient government. Because an efficient government is going to be more efficient at taking away your land and your money and your happiness. This is an interesting problem for us. What is a just state? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then notice the next part of this sentence. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now that becomes the sticking point. How do you create a system of government based on the consent of the governed that weighs people's individual freedoms with the need for political order? That's the fascinating tension that's in all of the basic documents of our founding. Love this book by Danielle Allen, Our Declaration. I encourage you to take a look at it. It leaves us, though, with another problem. We have a sense for the form of a just state, but what now? Which structures are going to help us promote freedom and order? That comes up in the next video. Thank you.